I was just in the White House in an Oval Office meeting between President Donald Trump and Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa. The meeting started off, pretty cordial. They were joking, laughing, talking about golf. But then it turned very tense very quickly when President Trump, he had a video queued up.
Turn the lights down and just put this on. It's right behind you.
And literally, I looked over my right shoulder and there was some White House aide. She had a laptop. She opens up the laptop. You see it happen really quickly. Everyone starts looking my way because I'm standing next to the TV. And then they dim the light and then they play this video and everybody had their eyes wide open.
What happens when a superpower suddenly freezes all aid, expels an ambassador, and brands Africa's most industrialized nation a violator of human rights? That's exactly what Washington did to South Africa in February 2025. But was this really about protecting rights, or about punishing a country for daring to challenge history and choose its own allies? Let's find that out. South Africans awoke to headlines that sounded more like the script of a geopolitical thriller than a diplomatic communique. With a single stroke of his pen, U.S. President Donald Trump announced an executive order that would freeze every cent of American aid flowing to South Africa. This was not a vague policy suggestion or a subtle warning. It was a binding order, immediately effective, and it came without the courtesy of quiet diplomacy. The move stunned not only Pretoria but also observers across Africa and beyond. The order was sweeping in scope. It suspended the long-standing streams of U.S. assistance that had supported health programs, development projects, and trade partnerships for decades. It declared South Africa guilty of egregious violations of human rights, accusing its government of implementing discriminatory land laws and of aligning itself with hostile powers. U.S. Embassy and consulates in South Africa reports, quote, President Donald J. Trump is committed to holding South Africa accountable for its actions. Even more startling was its unusual humanitarian twist. Trump instructed the State Department to prepare refugee resettlement pathways for white Afrikaner farmers, claiming they faced imminent persecution under South Africa's land reform policies. In the span of a few pages, a domestic policy in Pretoria was transformed into an international refugee narrative under Washington's pen. Within hours, the diplomatic fallout escalated. The U.S. government ordered the South African ambassador to leave Washington, severing a crucial line of communication at the height of the crisis. In Congress, a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a bill proposing targeted sanctions on South African officials accused of corruption and rights abuses. Suddenly, the relationship between the two nations, once characterized by robust trade under AGOA and shared programs in health security, was in freefall. For many in South Africa, the speed and severity of the measures signaled not just disapproval, but punishment designed to humiliate. The international media amplified the shock. American outlets framed the order as a bold defense of minority rights, highlighting the plight of farmers who claimed to be under threat of dispossession. European newspapers, however, noted the irony. Western governments that had tolerated far harsher land policies elsewhere were now singling out Pretoria with sanctions. The hate towards certain nations has been quite apparent for many years. African commentators were more direct. Many called it a reminder that even after decades of independence, the continent's choices could still be vetoed by powerful outsiders. In Pretoria, the government's response was swift and defiant. Officials rejected the accusations as baseless and reaffirmed that the Expropriation Act of 2024 was a constitutional mechanism designed to address inequality, not a weapon of persecution. The ruling party vowed to resist what it described as neo-colonial coercion. Crowds gathered in Johannesburg and Cape Town, carrying placards that read, "Our land, our choice, and Africa is not your colony." The mood was not one of despair, but of indignation, and anger sharpened by memories of how land had been stolen in the first place. Still, the implications were heavy. South Africa had been a major recipient of U.S. assistance, particularly in health, where American-funded programs had saved millions of lives in the fight against HIV/AIDS. Freezing that aid meant more than politics. It meant clinics scrambling for resources, patients fearing treatment interruptions, and civil society organizations wondering how to plug gaping holes in their budgets. At the same time, industries reliant on preferential trade access to the U.S. market began to question whether they too would soon be caught in the crossfire. The shock was not confined to economics or diplomacy. It was also symbolic. For Washington to brand Africa's most industrialized democracy as a violator of rights was a profound gesture, one that seemed to place Pretoria in the same category as states the U.S. usually describes as pariahs. The move left many wondering whether the real trigger was truly about property laws and refugees, or whether something deeper lay behind the sanctions. South Africa's growing defiance on the world stage. And that is the question that lingers. Was Trump's executive order simply a reaction to a land reform law, or was it a strategic strike against South Africa's independence in shaping its foreign and domestic policies? When the Trump administration framed South Africa's land reform as an attack on minority rights, it revived an old narrative that land redistribution is nothing more than racial vengeance dressed up as policy. Yet in South Africa, the land question is not a story of vengeance, it is the unfinished business of history. To understand why the Expropriation Act of 2024 has become the lightning rod for international condemnation, one must trace the scars of dispossession that still shape South Africa's landscape. The roots of the problem stretch back centuries, beginning with the colonial conquest that pushed indigenous communities off fertile plains and into barren reserves. Those dispossessions were later codified under apartheid, most brutally in the 1913 Land Act, which legally reserved the vast majority of arable land for white ownership. By the time apartheid collapsed in 1994, more than 80% of agricultural land remained in white hands, even though black South Africans made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Political liberation in 1994 brought voting rights, but the promise of land reform, central to the liberation struggle, proved far harder to deliver. For 3 decades, successive governments attempted a gradualist approach, the so-called willing buyer, willing seller model. Land was purchased at market rates and redistributed to new black farmers, yet progress was painfully slow. By 2017, only about 10% of farmland had been transferred, far short of the post-apartheid government's own targets. Many rural communities remained landless, locked in cycles of poverty that mirrored the geography of apartheid itself. Patience began to fray. The demand for deeper, faster reform grew louder, especially among younger South Africans who saw political freedom without economic redress as hollow. This is the context in which the Expropriation Act of 2024 emerged. The law empowers the state to expropriate land for a public purpose or in the public interest under certain conditions, including cases where land is abandoned, underutilized, or acquired through state subsidies. Compensation is still the default principle, but the law recognizes that in limited circumstances, nil compensation may be justifiable. Crucially, every case remains subject to judicial oversight. This is not a wholesale seizure of farms, nor does it target land based on race. It is a constitutional instrument designed to speed up reform within the boundaries of South Africa's legal system. But why is it so often misrepresented abroad? Part of the answer lies in how the issue has been politicized. For some in Washington and in the Western media, the image of white farmers facing dispossession makes for a stark narrative, one that obscures the reality that land reform is about correcting systemic injustice, not orchestrating racial purges. By elevating the Afrikaner farmer to the role of persecuted victim, critics reduce a centuries-old struggle into a soundbite about reverse apartheid. Yet this framing ignores the daily reality of millions of South Africans who remain dispossessed and impoverished while arable land lies concentrated in a few hands. The philosophical clash is stark. Should property rights be treated as absolute, even if they were acquired through unjust systems? Or should they be weighed against the moral imperative to redress historical wrongs? South Africa has chosen the latter path, cautiously, through its courts and constitution. Washington, by contrast, has treated any encroachment on property as evidence of discrimination. The contradiction is revealing. The U.S. has long tolerated eminent domain at home, where land is expropriated for highways, pipelines, or urban renewal projects, often with compensation far below market value. Yet when South Africa acts within its own constitutional framework, it is branded a violator of rights. This disconnect suggests that the battle is not merely about land, but about narrative control. If South Africa succeeds in demonstrating that historical justice can be pursued through law rather than violence, it challenges a broader Western orthodoxy that privileges the sanctity of property over the rectification of injustice. That is why the Expropriation Act is more than a domestic statute. It is a test case for whether post-colonial societies can rewrite the terms of ownership without waiting for external approval. And that brings us to the next part of this unfolding story. Who really pays the price when aid and sanctions become weapons in geopolitical games? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Sanctions are often announced in the grand language of morality, defending human rights, standing up to abuses, and ensuring accountability. But when the dust of rhetoric settles, the burden rarely falls on presidents or parliamentarians. It falls instead on the ordinary people whose lives depend on the very programs that sanctions interrupt. In South Africa's case, the US aid freeze has struck hardest at the vulnerable, not the powerful. Consider health. For 2 decades, American assistance under PEPFAR has been a pillar of South Africa's fight against HIV/AIDS. It is no exaggeration to say millions of lives have been extended and protected because of that partnership. Clinics across rural provinces have relied on steady US funding to supply antiretroviral drugs, test kits, and counseling services. The sudden suspension of those funds in February 2025 left administrators scrambling. Stockpiles that were once stable began to thin. Outreach workers found themselves uncertain whether salaries would be paid. Patients arriving for refills heard whispers of looming shortages. The cruel irony is hard to ignore. Washington framed its actions as a defense of minority rights, but the first casualties were the poorest Black South Africans living with a virus that knows no race. For them, geopolitics was not an abstract debate, but a looming question. Will the pill that keeps me alive still be here next month? It is in these quiet, anxious questions, asked in waiting rooms and community halls, that the real cost of sanctions reveals itself. The economic impact is equally tangible. South Africa's industries, from wine and citrus to automobiles and metals, have long depended on preferential access to the US market through the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. The threat of tariffs or exclusion sends ripples through these sectors. Farmers in the Western Cape fear losing their largest export destination. Manufacturers in Gauteng worry that contracts with US buyers could evaporate overnight. For small and medium enterprises integrated into these supply chains, even the possibility of sanctions creates uncertainty that chokes investment and hiring. There is also the financial dimension. Markets are sensitive to signals, and Washington's sanction threat is one of the loudest. The rand weakened in the days after the executive order, as investors worried about capital flight. For ordinary South Africans, that translated quickly into higher fuel and food costs. Everyday inflation triggered not by domestic mismanagement, but by an external decision. The irony is sharp. Sanctions justified in the name of protecting rights end up eroding the purchasing power of the very people those rights are supposed to protect. But beyond the human and economic toll, there is a strategic cost that Washington seems blind to. By turning aid and trade into levers of discipline, the US signals to South Africa, and to Africa more broadly, that dependency is a liability. The natural response is diversification. Already, Pretoria has accelerated talks with China for credit lines to plug the aid gap. Russian envoys have hinted at expanded energy cooperation. BRICS platforms are being touted as alternatives for development finance. Each of these steps dilutes Washington's influence. What begins as punishment may paradoxically push South Africa closer to the very partners the US wishes to counter. This boomerang effect has been observed before. In the 1960s, US sanctions against newly independent African states often drove them into Soviet arms. In the 2000s, conditional aid pushed countries like Ethiopia and Sudan towards China, which offered loans without political strings. Today, the pattern repeats. Coercion begets realignment. The question for Washington is whether the symbolic satisfaction of disciplining South Africa is worth the long-term cost of driving Africa into alternative networks of power. And here lies the philosophical crux. If sanctions are supposed to defend universal values, Why do they so often undermine the very human dignity they claim to protect? When a patient misses treatment, when a farmer loses a contract, when a family pays more for bread, are these not rights issues too? South Africa has seized on this contradiction in its public response, framing U.S. actions as coercive, hypocritical, and ultimately self-defeating. The more Washington claims to defend justice, the more its methods appear to violate it. This leaves us with a final, unavoidable question. If sanctions cannot break South Africa's resolve, and instead deepen its pivot to new allies, what does this moment mean for Africa's future place in the world? Is this the turning point where the continent begins to act not as a recipient of orders, but as an architect of its own destiny? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When Washington froze aid and expelled South Africa's ambassador, it did more than trigger a bilateral quarrel. It lit a spark across the continent. From Accra to Lusaka, commentators began asking whether the old rules of global hierarchy still applied. Was Africa forever destined to be disciplined for making its own choices? Or could this confrontation mark the birth of a new posture, one in which African states insist on being players, not pawns? The symbolism of South Africa standing firm is powerful. This is not a small or isolated state. It is Africa's most industrialized economy, a member of the G20 and a founding member of BRICS. Its decisions carry weight. When Pretoria says it will not be coerced, it is not just defending its own sovereignty. It is quietly affirming that Africa has the right to pursue justice on its own terms. That stance resonates deeply in a continent where memories of colonial diktats remain fresh, and where neo-colonial pressures still lurk behind the language of partnership. There is also a generational aspect. Young Africans, who make up the majority of the continent's population, are increasingly skeptical of the idea that the West is a benevolent patron. They see how aid is used as leverage, how trade preferences come with conditions, and how diplomatic friendship often masks strategic extraction. For them, South Africa's defiance is less about one nation's policy and more about a model that African countries can say no, can bear the costs, and can build alternatives. In that sense, the sanctions may have inadvertently achieved what decades of rhetoric about the African Renaissance struggled to do. They made sovereignty feel urgent and real. Of course, sovereignty is not a slogan. It demands material foundations. This is where South Africa's crisis intersects with Africa's broader trajectory. The continent has already begun constructing tools of independence. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, and growing regional security pacts. These projects are fragile, still finding their footing, but they are designed precisely to reduce reliance on external approval. The more Washington weaponizes aid and trade, the stronger the incentive for African states to pour energy into these homegrown mechanisms. The geopolitical landscape also favors this shift. China is Africa's largest trading partner. Russia is pushing deeper into energy and security cooperation, and countries like Turkey, India, and the Gulf states are vying for influence. The sanctions against South Africa, therefore, do not leave it isolated. They push it into a crowded marketplace of alternatives. This is not without risks. New dependencies can be as constraining as old ones, but they create breathing room. For the first time in decades, African states have real choices. The U.S. no longer holds a monopoly on resources markets or legitimacy. That change alters the bargaining table fundamentally. Yet perhaps the most profound effect is psychological. For too long, Africa's political class has operated under an implicit assumption: anger the West, and survival becomes impossible. South Africa's defiance challenges that logic. If Pretoria weathers the storm, if clinics stay open with alternative funding, if trade finds new partners, if diplomacy continues through new channels, then the myth of inevitable collapse under Western disapproval will begin to crumble. Other African governments will take note. The balance of fear will shift, and with it, the balance of power. But this moment also demands caution. Independence is not achieved by rhetoric alone. South Africa and its allies will need to manage the immediate fallout carefully, ensuring that ordinary citizens do not pay the highest price. They will need to prove that sovereignty can coexist with stability, that defiance can yield constructive alternatives rather than chaos. The stakes are high. If Pretoria succeeds, it sets a precedent that emboldens the continent. If it falters, it risks reinforcing the argument that Africa cannot afford to disobey. In the end, the US-South Africa standoff is not simply a dispute about land aid or foreign policy. It is a test of whether Africa can finally escape the shadow of external approval. Every decision, every headline, every protest placard in Johannesburg carries a weight far beyond national borders. The question is no longer whether sanctions will hurt. They already do. The question is whether that pain can be transformed into the resolve to build something new, a sovereignty that is not conditional, not borrowed, but truly African. And that is why this moment matters. It is not about Trump's executive order alone. It is about whether Africa decides once and for all that its destiny will not be written in Washington or Brussels, but in Addis Ababa, Pretoria, Lagos, and Nairobi. History is watching, the world is adjusting, and Africa is beginning, slowly but unmistakably, to speak in its own voice. Do you think Washington's sanctions are really about human rights or about punishing South Africa for standing independent? Let us know in the comments section. Should Africa continue relying on Western aid if it can be weaponized overnight? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.